there's been so many studies on electromagnetic fields having biological effect, like thousands. If you saw the clip from RFK talking on Rogan,
oh yeah,
said there are thousands. Joe, there are thousands of
5G
studies.
5G crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah. Well, that study was from Alan Frey, 1975, was funded by the U.S. Navy for 15 years because guess who was interested in radar and microwaves? The military. So that's where a lot of this research in the 50s, 60s, 70s was all from the military, and they were interested. And there was some, like sidebar DARPA stuff to look at like what was going on in the Russian embassy, which we can talk about. But really, he found a lot of biological effects at low power density. And it just so happened that the frequencies he was looking at are the same exact frequencies being used for telecommunications today. There's no way like we would have known, but they're around 2 to 4 gigahertz. They're called microwaves. They're the same frequency as the radio, communications we use, probably just different modulation techniques because they're not transmitting data for cell phones. They're like radar equipment. And he found that it opens up the blood-brain barrier. He found that it made rats very docile. He found at a very low power density, he stopped a frog's heart like completely from just exposure to.
Who was doing this?
Alan Frey. He worked. Yeah, he worked for GE, and he went down this rabbit hole because some like operator came to him and was like, "Hey man, I can hear the radar," and he's like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "No, I can hear the radar. Come check it out." And he could hear it too. And they realized and they figured out that it wasn't from the ears. It was a neurological response from the microwaves. And Alan Frey, and there's this whole debate, literally a microwave debate in the 70s about this stuff. Especially because the Russian embassy crisis, people kind of got freaked out.
Yeah,
and then
Havana syndrome stuff.
There was a GE, another thing with ionizing radiation where TVs that GE made unfortunately had X-ray exposure by accident. So then the public became like very distrusting of technology for a little bit. And then they kind of like was a big deal. Someone wrote a book called Zapping of America, Paul Brodeur, and then it kind of just went away. Like they were like after the 70s, just swept it under the rug and no one's connected the dots since. And now they're like, well, there's been no studies on 4G and 5G, but a lot of biological effects have been studied for the same exact frequencies for decades. And there's thousands of studies even since 1990 that are showing harmful biological effects. Thousands.
Really?
But they're mostly on rodents. A lot of them are epidemiological. It's really hard to do studies on people with electromagnetic fields. And some of the population-based studies that they've done have been, pretty damning.
Have you looked at how deep have you looked into the Havana syndrome stuff? Like the people that have these symptoms of like really bad tinnitus, their ears ringing, and like hearing voices in their heads, crazy migraines, like unbearable migraines. People that were in the embassy in Cuba and as well in Moscow that experienced this stuff.
I'm familiar with the Moscow signal and the Moscow embassy. I've read a lot about that. And that was basically, it's funny. This was like a big topic during the Cold War because Russia was very much aware or like stringent on electromagnetic fields. And they had 1,000 times stricter thresholds for microwave radio frequency safety. And they, were in a Cold War. And for whatever reason, they decided to mock the U.S. and blast the embassy, the U.S. embassy in Moscow, for over 15 years. I think it was maybe even 20 years with a quote-unquote low-intensity, low-intensity signal in the microwave range, 2.5 to 4 gigahertz, which is exactly, your Wi-Fi is at 2.4 gigahertz. Your phone in 5G midband is operating roughly in that area.
But these aren't, so the difference is these were directed, right? These were shooting like a gun out of some sort of a device.
No, it was just like, it was just being beamed from like a building onto the U.S. embassy.
Oh, like a big wide blanket.
Like this
beam?
wasn't like, hey, we're doing this. This was like, they never have admitted to this day that they did this.
Right.
So
we have no idea how they actually have to. Like
Exactly.
it didn't necessarily. Like I would imagine that if I was the Russian intelligence agency KGB and I knew that the CIA was right across the street, we could go in the building and we could get some sort of like crowd control device that shot fucking 5G right at the building at a certain, because it was directed at certain floors.
Yeah, I think
like
so.
there was only
Yeah.
certain floors where people had those really bad symptoms.
Yeah, yeah. And they did some weird, like the US kind of freaked out, but they couldn't tell anybody because they were like, well, it's under our safety threshold.
Yeah.
So they're in like a catch-22.
Yes.
And they started doing these side projects like Project Pandora, Project Bizarre. Project Pandora was they took a couple monkeys and tested it with like 5 microwatts per centimeter squared, which was 50% of the US's current safety threshold, and they were just trying to figure out like, is this actually dangerous? And that's really high, by the way. That's like maybe the peak transmission of your cell phone for 1 second. They blasted these monkeys for 10 hours a day, and for 10 to 12 days straight. And on like the 10th, 11th, 12th day, the monkeys would straight up fall asleep, like standing up.
And not wake up?
They would just be like zombies. They were performing all these tasks apparently. And then eventually on like the 10th, 11th, 12th day, they would just like basically be asleep, but not asleep. And then every time they did it, like they let them recover and then they would do it again. It was a shorter time. And then eventually they just stopped the studies and the monkeys like never technically recovered. But that's not, I'm going to say that's not indicative of like normal cell phone exposure.
It's way more, yeah.
But you should be pretty concerned,
sure,
like in any capacity that exists. And then there was some more studies. They ran some blood work and they didn't really tell people. And eventually, you know, people figured it out and like broke the news, and it was a big deal. But it was so inconclusive that no standards, nothing was really changed at all.
Right. And then there was also the Philadelphia experiments that were done in the US where they were shooting like frequency beams at some of the sailors that were on the ship, some of the Navy guys.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that one, but there's a lot.
A lot of crazy. The Cold War, dude, was like one of the craziest, most sci-fi dystopian periods in America, bro.
And that's where people are like, oh, there's all this like, you know, MK Ultra stuff. I'm like, this was for war. They were just trying to figure out and get the upper hand. And a lot of progress was made, but a lot of
we went to the moon.
Crazy stuff was going on. I'll say that. But what I want to say is there is no shortage of evidence that there's potential biological effect. It's just the context.
No shortage of evidence that there's biological effect.
I mean, there's so many studies, hundreds and hundreds of studies from that time period. Even more if you want to look at actually the Russian studies, which are way more, you know, I would say fair in terms of how they're measuring effects. Because what you're saying with like Havana syndrome, Russia acknowledged, I think it's called like asthenia, or what we call today hyperelectrosensitivity, that there is a repercussion from overexposure long-term to electromagnetic fields. And it's funny, 2 of the pioneers of technology in the early 20th century, Nikola Tesla and Marconi, the radio guy. Marconi at the end of his life had like 5 heart attacks in 10 years. And the dude was literally, on radio transmission all day. And Tesla was always playing around with stuff. And he literally went crazy in his later years, died poor. And if you look at it from, an unbiased perspective, you would say that for sure both of them had electrohypersensitivity or some sort of electromagnetic related condition, because they were just, their nervous systems and bodies were fried.